What is my trust tax ID number? So the trust tax ID number is typically going to be your own social security number while you're alive, right? So the IRS does prefer that you use your own social security number for the revocable living trust. If you have an irrevocable trust, that's different, right? An irrevocable trust does have its own separate tax ID number, but your revocable trust does not. Uses your social. And as long as you're acting as the trustee, you're not going to need to get a separate tax ID number or file separate tax returns. All of the income that's generated by trust assets just flows through to your own personal tax returns. So that's just an important little piece to note. We do get calls a lot from clients about that. The bank wants to know what the tax ID number for the trust is. Well, it's just your social. Again, your own particular situation may be different, but in general, if it is a revocable trust, it's going to use your own social. Oh, and if you're married, your trust may state that it can be identified by either one, the husband or the wife's social security number, either one of the spouse's numbers. So sometimes it might just say it would be identified by the husband's or just by the wife's. So your trust might control that a little bit, but most of the time, again, just using your own social is fine. So I mentioned a second ago that when your trust becomes irrevocable, however, it does get a new tax ID number, and it typically becomes irrevocable when you pass away. If you're married and your spouse is still alive, it's definitely important for that spouse to get some legal counsel and have the trust reviewed to see if the trust stays all intact in the one bucket for the surviving spouse, or whether the trust requires a split of the assets. If the trust requires that the thing split up into one or into two or more multiple trusts, each of those additional trusts will get their own tax ID numbers. If your trust doesn't call for a split, if it allows everything to stay in the one bucket for the surviving spouse, it is typically going to remain revocable and amendable by the surviving spouse and use the spouse's social as they move forward. But we have seen some older trusts that say that when the first spouse dies, the entire trust becomes irrevocable and cannot be changed. It's not as common to see that language in more current documents, but if your documents were done in the 80s or 90s and have never had an update, or even early 2000s, that may be something that's in your document. So again, it's strongly recommended that not only the surviving spouse, but whoever the successors are, consult with legal counsel, possibly tax CPA, tax person, to help them understand, do they need a new tax ID number? How will the tax be reported as they move forward, et cetera?